Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to the 7th of the North Wessex Downs AONB series of webinars on farming and the environment. My name is Corinna Woodall, and I'm the Senior Project Development and Funding Officer for the AONB, and I will be chairing today's session. This lunchtime's talk is focused on the long-anticipated Farming and Protected Landscapes grant programme, and this is going to be presented to us by Henry Oliver, the Director of the North Wessex Downs AONB. Before we start the main session, there are a few bits of housekeeping. We will have some time for comments and questions after the presentation. The chat function is disabled at the moment, but at the bottom of your screen you should see the Q&A button. Feel free to type in your questions here whenever you like. I'm afraid we can't guarantee to answer all of them, but we will do our very best to cover as many as we can. The webinar will be recorded, and afterwards you will receive an email with a link to the recording, which will be available afterwards on our YouTube channel. So now it's my very great pleasure to hand over to Henry to tell us what he can at this stage about this exciting opportunity for farmers and land managers in our area of outstanding natural beauty. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Corinna. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. I'm just going to share my screen with you, I hope. Corinna, can you see my slideshow?
Keep trying. Yeah, we're all good. Got it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Sorry, we've practiced that several times, but still managed to fluff it. The first thing I'm going to say is a slight cautionary note, which is just that this is the best information available to us at the moment. Those of you who've been following the Farming and Protected Landscapes saga will know that it's been put together over some time, but the launch has been done at breakneck speed, and we've only quite recently been shown the national framework, the 21 accompanying annexes, and things never move very fast in local government. We're hosted by a local authority, so we're busy getting approval for the posts we need to run the programme, recruiting staff, appointing a panel, setting up the systems, and that means that we're not actually up and running yet. We will be as soon as we possibly can, and in the interim we definitely do want to hear from anyone who's interested in the programme, and it's an opportunity for you to develop your proposals ready for when we're ready to accept applications. And I also just want to explain that this slideshow is a standard Defra slideshow with a few North Wessex Downs insertions, which we've been asked to use as a standard across the country. So forgive me if there are certain elements which don't feel very local, but this is the broad message that Defra have asked us to put across. So, hoping that I can move on to my next slide. National parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty are special and unique, and together they make up some of our most beautiful and iconic protected landscapes. There are 34 AONBs in England, covering about a quarter of the total land area. And they range from lowland landscapes like the Cotswolds and the Norfolk coast to uplands like the North Pennines and the Lake District. And by having that wide geographical range, they contain a really wide range of species that are important for nature and nature recovery. And within the national parks of England are contained something like 41% of upland hay meadows and 80% of upland chalk grassland. And the AONBs have their fair share of valuable habitat and rare species. And protected landscapes do a lot to support local rural communities, helping to support jobs and investment. National parks attract 94 million visitors a year and directly support 75,000 jobs, while combined AONBs and national parks attract over 260 million visitors a year. They also have an important part to play in our health and well-being. Around 64% of England's population lives within 15 miles of a national park or an AONB, and they're obviously great places to walk and cycle and explore. And by supporting the farmers and the land managers and the people who have created and maintained the landscape that's so attractive and who live and work in these areas, we can help protect these exceptional places and support local communities. So on to the programme itself. It's important to emphasise that it's open to all farmers and land managers in any AONB or national park or the Broads. Not just people who are in receipt of basic payment, not just people who farm, but all farmers and land managers. And in order to help that support, Defra is introducing the programme. It's going to run, sorry, bear with me. I think I've skipped a slide. There we are. It's going to run from July 2021 to March 2024. And it has 4 key headline objectives that relate to nature, biodiversity, recovery, mitigating the impacts of climate change, access, education, understanding, enjoyment, including cultural heritage, and supporting nature-friendly, sustainable farm businesses. And the programme has been developed by Defra with the support of a group of people, including National Park and AONB staff from across England. Now, who's eligible? As I said, it's open to all farmers and land managers. It could also support activity on other land, as long as your project will benefit the protected landscape or the AONB partnership's objectives or its partnership initiatives. So for example, if you were part of a farmer cluster that straddled the boundary, then if you were outside, part of the land was outside, that would nevertheless be potentially eligible. And obviously a number of public engagement and access initiatives may relate to the surrounding area as well. Other organisations, and to apply, you must manage all the land included in the application and have control of all the activities you'd like to do, or you must have written consent from the people who have those powers. Other organisations and individuals can apply as long as they collaborate with a farmer or a land manager or in support of a farmer or a group of farmers. So it's not just the direct farmers and land managers, it could be other bodies, and there is more information available on that in the more detailed guidance. And I should add that there is a whole lot more detail than we're able to go through in this presentation available on our website, on Defra's website, which you can have a look at subsequently if you're interested. Common land is also eligible, and you can apply either as a landowner with sole rights or as a group of entities who share the rights and benefits acting together. And depending on the size of that group, you may or may not need a formal commons agreement or a more informal partnership agreement. And let's say a little bit more about the 4 themes, because you know, when they're reduced to one word, they're quite hard to determine. So climate, nature, people and place. You can find a full list of the outcomes on gov.uk, but to give you some examples, if we're talking about climate, storing more carbon, sequestering more carbon, or both. So soil health is a particular potential area of activity. Reducing flood risk, better understanding among farmers, land managers and the public as to what different habitats and land uses can deliver for carbon storage and reduce carbon emissions, and a landscape that's more resilient in the face of climate change. Under nature and nature recovery, obviously a greater habitat area of wildlife rich habitat is an obvious area of interest, but also greater habitat connectivity. And of course, you could link that with climate in terms of resilience in the face of climate change, and better management of existing habitats for biodiversity, and just generally increasing biodiversity. On the people front, more opportunities for people to explore, enjoy and understand the landscape, and particularly focusing on diverse audiences, perhaps those audiences who are, for whatever reason, because they are from minority ethnic groups or disadvantaged communities, or particularly disadvantaged urban communities, maybe around the AONB or the National Park, they are a priority in line with the Glover Review of Protected Landscapes that reported in 2019. And also greater public engagement in land management through volunteering, for example. Place is the fourth one. That could be about enhancing or reinforcing the quality and character of the landscape, conserving historic structures, landscape features, enhancing or interpreting them. Or it could be an increase in the resilience of nature-friendly, sustainable farm businesses, where it contributes to a thriving local economy, where that's connected with the objectives of the AONB. Now, those are the four headline objectives that Defra has set nationally, but there's a crucial element to this, if you like, a filter through which all of this is then seen, which is that your project must support the priorities of your protected landscape body's management plan. So for those of you who don't know, the North Wessex Downs AONB, like every AONB, has a statutory management plan. It's reviewed every 5 years. It's adopted by the local authority partners. It's approved by the Secretary of State. And the management plan has a series of land management priorities, which I'll come on to in more detail in a moment. Defra have given us some broad examples of projects. I'm not going to go into them in very much detail, but you can see them in front of you. There are just some ideas that try to relate to the different headings of nature, climate, people and place. Now, I mentioned the management plan. This is our current management plan front cover. It's available on our website. If you would prefer to have a paper copy, we do have some. You can drop us a line and we can send one to you in the post. It may take a little while because our offices are still officially closed because of COVID at the moment, but we can pop in there and send you one if you really want one. I wanted to say a little bit more before we move on to some of the other aspects of the scheme nationally about the local priorities. So the management plan is the statutory document that influences everything we do as a partnership. The North Wessex Downs is governed by a council of partners, which has the 9 local authorities and 15 other representatives of community, parish, farming, rural business, heritage, recreation, tourism, nature conservation interests. And this is, if you like, the headline. There are policies in there, there are objectives, and in particular, there is some focus on land management. Now, we have a whole set of land management objectives for each one of the landscape character types of the North Wessex Downs. I'm just going to flick a little bit first around my slides to show you, for anybody who's a bit hazy about the geography, this is the North Wessex Downs. At the far western end, you've got Devizes, the far eastern end, Reading, going south towards Andover, Whitchurch, Overton, Basingstoke. North, we meet Cairn, Swindon, Wantage, and Didcot. And we have Newbury in that sort of gap at the eastern end that isn't part of the AONB. And then you can see the chalk rivers draining through that landscape from the Downs. Now that area is divided into landscape character areas. And there are 35 of them, and you'll be relieved that I'm not going to go through them in detail now, but they're all available on our website if you want to find out more about them in the landscape character assessment. But this is the crucial bit for now. You see the different colours on that slide. Each one of those is a landscape character type. For example, the Downs, Plain and Scarp, the Vales, Open Downland, River Valleys. And obviously, because they're different landscape character type, different landscape management interventions are appropriate in different ones, or there are some that move across all of them. So I'm just going to go back to that slide I showed you a moment before, which is the priorities for different landscape character types. And in the management plan, these are set out in little tables, and you will be given in the chat and in the subsequent follow-up email to this talk a web link with a little bit of instruction about where to find this information. So you don't need to write it all down. The presentation is going to be available, and so is the link to the management plan. But I just want to pick up on some of these to give you a feel for the sorts of things that we will be looking for in terms of what those 4 Defra priorities mean in local terms. These ones are generic and crossing every boundary, supporting a landscape scale approach to habitat, whether it's restoring, managing, buffering, extending, connecting the locally characteristic habitats to support the key species, enable them to be more resilient and increase the populations. And there are particular interests in species-rich chalk grassland, high nature value arable farming, wet pasture, native riparian woodland, heathland restoration, ancient woodland restoration, and chalk streams. If the North Wessex Downs is special for one thing, it's special for its extraordinary archaeological value. And so archaeology, whether it's prehistoric archaeology, which is perhaps our specialism, or much more modern archaeology, is also part of what this programme is here to support. Catchment sensitive farming to address the importance of the chalk downs as largely the tap of London and the southeast flowing into the Kennet and the Thames for water quality, ecological restoration of chalk streams, addressing diffuse and point source pollution, reducing sediment runoff, and so on. Habitat corridors run throughout the area, whether it's on roads or field boundaries. And public access is something that we want to facilitate and enable much more perhaps than we've been able in the past, in a responsible way where it fits with the businesses that are managing the land and also with the nature conservation value of the landscape and its archaeological heritage. And then finally, but importantly, I think in relation to this programme, encouraging and supporting more wildlife friendly management of public and private open space. Now, you can't use FIPL funding to improve your garden, however big your garden is, but you can use it potentially for public open spaces which may currently be managed in ways that are much less sympathetic to nature conservation than they might be. So I'm going to go back to those maps, just another look at the AONB. Those little sort of hieroglyphics on there are what we call the icons of the North Wessex Downs that represent particular features of the landscape and the landscape character types. Now I'm very quickly, because I don't want to waste time that we could spend doing questions and answers, going to flick through the lists for each of those character types. Forgive me if you don't have time to read each one because there's a lot of text. I've simply taken the text, put it on the page as big as I can for you to read to give you a flavour. But as I say, that information is available in our management plan, and you will be sent links and information about how to find it. This is what they look like in the management plan. I haven't put them in the presentation individually because it's quite hard to read, but you're looking for some pages that look like that. Where are we with table 4? Restoring unmanaged relict grassland, maintaining chalk grassland, enhancing the mix of arable land and chalk grass, and particularly for priority farmland bird species and arable plants through the various elements that are required, the food for insects that creates the food for chicks, the food in the hungry gap, and the nesting capacity and management for those farmland birds, and all the other benefits that come with that. Improving in the non-traditional sense, in other words, making more diverse semi-improved permanent grassland, especially where it's next to unimproved grassland. Maybe some arable reversion for landscape enhancement in certain places. Maintaining The open landscape character, that's more of an avoidance one, so possibly less appropriate here. But if you like, planting the trees in the right places and hedges rather than where they don't go with the existing landscape character. Archaeological sites and features. Prehistoric archaeological sites are still most at risk from cultivation. So removing them from cultivation and then protecting them from burrowing animals, which is threat number 2, is another thing that you can do. And all sorts of wildlife corridor activity and so on. Then we look at a different area where there's perhaps more scope for woodland restoration and connectivity because there's more woodland in the landscape. We're particularly interested in projects that might support veteran and ancient trees and possibly creation of new wood pasture habitats. But there's a whole range of things that are valid there. Then when we have more wooded areas, we are definitely interested in maintaining and enhancing the mosaic of woodland with other habitats we have, perhaps restoring and protecting archaeology within wooded areas, restoring heathland where possible. We'd be very interested in projects there where we can reintroduce grazing, restoring plantations on ancient woodland sites, and of course, hand in hand with that, deer management, for example, to enable people to actually manage their woodland in an economically viable way, as well as providing landscape biodiversity and possibly, where there's public access, amenity benefits. You have to forgive me, my screen doesn't show me the title at the top of each of these slides. So I slightly have to guess which character type we're in because it's blanked out by the bar at the top. Here we are again having an interest in existing chalk grassland, semi-improved permanent grassland, and all those chalk habitats, but also the arable land management. And of course, you could link in with your arable land management for biodiversity, not just elements of public access, but a climate element in terms of soil sequestration, possibly through changing the way that you manage your soil, moving towards a min-till or a no-till model in certain cases. And the programme can support aspects of that. On Salisbury Plain, we only have a little bit of Salisbury Plain. There's a much a bespoke but familiar list of particular aims and objectives. And then in our river valleys, we're interested in a whole range of things. Wet woodland is a particular feature, but also floodplain and wet meadows. And nearby, we tend to have quite a lot of historic parks and estates. We've got watercress beds. And we're also interested in addressing the landscape change that will come from ash diebacks, already coming from ash dieback, in terms of promoting new hedge trees in the landscape. And in terms of climate change here, as those of you who know about chalk streams will know much better than me, one of the issues is warming of the chalk stream habitat, literally, of the water, and therefore a need for a certain amount of riparian shading to provide the shade that enables the ecology to continue despite higher temperatures at certain times of the year. And then finally here we have more on valleys and woodland, which I've just mentioned an aspect of that. And in the lowland mosaic, which is the eastern end of the AONB towards Newbury, we have a very different kind of landscape where we need perhaps a much finer grain approach. But here there's a lot of opportunity, I think, in terms of hedge restoration, better hedge management, possibly restoration and connection of bits of relict heathland and restoration of some of those areas. And also the network of lanes whose banks and verges can be both historic features in themselves, but also one of the last vestiges for some of our wildflowers. So management and protection of them. That's a very brief run through of what different landscape character types in the AONB might mean for projects, and it has a particular focus on biodiversity and landscape character, but you can see there how public engagement, public access, possibly rural business, and climate and carbon can be woven into all of those. In terms of the funding, going back to the Defra slideshow, you could get up to 100% if you won't make a commercial gain from it, but if you will benefit commercially, then there's a proportion of the cost that's fundable, and the amount will depend on how much the project will benefit your business. And that's a conversation we have to have alongside your application. Now, it's important to say that this programme is working alongside and not in competition with Defra's existing and new schemes to add value where it's most needed. So if your scheme can be rewarded through another scheme, sorry, your proposal through another scheme, then we might well be saying to you, well, actually, we think probably you should be applying to the slurry fund or a particular woodland fund, because this is about reaching the parts that those funds can't reach. You still can get funding for the programme if you're in an agri-environment scheme, as long as you're not paid twice for the same work, obviously. And if your project is the same as something that could be funded under stewardship, you'll be paid the same as the stewardship rate. And if it's not the same as a stewardship activity, we would be offering funding, based on the estimated costs. A little bit about how to apply, with the caveat that, as I say, we in the North Wessex Downs are not quite there yet, but bear with us, please. First, you need to contact us or your protected landscape, if it's a different one, to discuss your intended project before applying. Now, that's intended to save everyone time, effort and money, so that we can have a conversation with you about the extent to which your proposal fits with our landscape objectives and Defra's landscape objectives, and whether there are things that we think you should be amending or that you might have missed or that could be added on that might improve the chances of your project being successful. Then you need to ask us for an application form. When you're ready to submit, we will give you an application form and you can fill it in. And it is very much part of the role of our dedicated farming and protected landscape staff, when we have them, to help you put that together and bring it forward. And you can apply this year from now until the 31st of January next year for the first year of the programme. Multi-year awards are possible. We will be awarding funds throughout the process, so don't wait until the end of the window. Once you're ready, we want to see your application form when we get there, and you can be, higher up in the queue. We will also consider applications for funding in the second year of the programme, particularly if you want to start work early in the next financial year. And it's also possible to have awards that run over more than 1 year, perhaps if you've got a staged project, but everything must be done and finished by the end of March 2024. I should say that although we're not yet ready to receive applications, we do want to hear from you, and we will do what we can within our existing resources to help you develop suitable proposals ready for when the systems are up and running. And then, assuming you are successful, after your agreement ends, you wouldn't have to maintain any of the activities, management activities that have been funded after your agreement ends. That's partly to enable everyone to move into ELM with no ifs and buts and obstacles. You must, however, maintain capital infrastructure for 5 years from the completion date. And similarly, you must maintain machinery assets. For example, if you were having part of the cost of a brush harvester or a direct drill funded, then you would need to keep that for 5 years from the purchase date. Similar to LEADER, for those of you who've been involved with the LEADER programme. How will it be scored? Well, you can see on the screen, those are the percentages. Where your application is over £5,000, that will be judged by a local assessment panel. One of the things we're doing at the moment is appointing a local assessment panel. It's going to have a strong element of farming and land management representation. It will also have Natural England on it. It'll have at least one person from the North Wessex Downs AONB team and a number of other people with expertise in heritage, nature conservation, access, water, wherever possible, and we hope carbon and climate change. And what would happen is the Farming and Protected Landscapes officer would assess your application, score it, give an initial score. That would then go to the local assessment panel for a determination, and then you would hear the outcome. And for anything under £5,000, those will be scored by the officer again in the same way, but instead of going to the local assessment panel, they will be determined by a senior member of the AONB team who hasn't been involved in the application, advising or assessing the application earlier on. In terms of the next steps, you can contact us, in our case, or your relevant protected landscape body. This presentation has a hyperlink there to a Defra page, which has all the AONBs and national parks in the country listed. To get more information, we are, I hope, going to have a sort of contact form on our website, which will enable you to fill it in and send it in to us before we have a conversation, just to give us a bit of a feel for what it is you have in mind, so that we can start off with a bit more information. But at the moment that isn't up there. So at this stage, contact us. First, have a look at our website, look at the Farming and Protected Landscapes information there, then get in touch with us and we will do our best to engage with you as best we can. Look at the gov.uk information on the programme and the related blog posts and other bits and pieces, and sign up to the Defra e-alert. Those are all the different things you can do, but you can obviously also sign up to our newsletter, and you can enable us to contact you about our farming and land management work by ticking that box when you sign up for webinars like this and fill in the feedback form afterwards. I want to just say one more thing before we move on to the questions, which is that it's very clear in the Defra guidance that they will support, and they're very keen on, as are we, projects that cover more than one of those four themes, which is one reason why I've talked about the way they interact several times in this presentation. We want to encourage you, wherever possible, to weave them all in, because protected landscapes are, of course, about biodiversity, but they're also about carbon, climate change, drainage, access, and the viability of rural businesses. So in our view, wherever they can be woven together, that's good. One other thing is that survey work, advice, training work, perhaps bringing a group of farmers or land managers together in a new group, or helping an existing group to map out what they could do, is eligible. There's guidance from Defra that it should be up to a certain limit of the total programme, but it should be linked to actual activity happening on the ground in due course. So if you wanted to apply, for example, I was talking to somebody the other day who has a farmer group just getting together, who wanted to look at surveying the marginal habitats across all the members' land and thinking what they could best do in an integrated way on a landscape scale for nature conservation. That could be possible and that could be funded, with the understanding that they would come back for more money to actually implement the recommendations, perhaps in the following year. So just to give you a feel for how Defra sees the programme working in terms of advice, research and coordination and training. And now I am going to hand back over for questions.
Right. Thank you very much, Henry. You've covered an awful lot of ground there, and as we've emphasised, we'll be sending you lots of links out after this session, and just refer you to have a look at the different parts of the management plan, which hopefully you will find helpful as well. So we now have the question and answer session. So do feel free to add any questions into that bottom box. We already have a few questions in there, but you can bet that if you're wondering about something that Henry has said or not said, that other people will be doing that as well. So please feel free just to put your questions into that Q&A box. We're going to have some additional help now from Claire McCorkadale, who's our partnership coordinator, who's going to be helping me field the questions. So if we can go over to you, Claire, can we have your first question, please?
Hi there. The first question is from Alison Cross. Does an existing agreement constitute written consent, for example, where there is a facilitation fund agreement in place?
I'm going to preface everything I say with the slight cop-out that we're still learning, and I am absolutely not master of all the detail. And the honest answer to that is I do not know, but I suspect that showing that you have the facilitation fund agreement in place would be sufficient for us to be aware that you have that permission. We might need to check with Defra and the RPA as part of the checks process. And I should say that as part of the whole application process, there is a set series of checks that we have to undertake where we're referring to the RPA, to the Forestry Commission, just to double check that our understanding and your understanding is correct, so that we don't end up handing out money to you and then having to claw it back.
I think also from some of the discussion that I've been seeing around what's eligible in different processes, that there may well also be a requirement for agreements, but I think Defra being relatively relaxed as to what those may be and leaving those sort of to the local protected landscapes to determine locally. But I guess it depends on what the arrangements are, but I think they're leaving us to have that flexibility. So, you know, we're used to having standard agreements for other projects, and it may be that we look at adapting some of those. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. We've got a question here from Tim Haywood saying, will funding for sequestration conflict with ELMS or carbon trading? Would we need to choose the most appropriate scheme to avoid double funding, or could they coexist?
Okay, it shouldn't conflict with ELM because Defra sees farming and protected landscapes as part of the agricultural transition plan, and if you like, a time limited program as distinct from a scheme that will be part of the move from basic payment and stewardship to ELM. And as part of the development of the program, just to give you an example of that, it was flagged up that they had said that if you were involved in a sustainable farming incentive pilot, you would be ineligible for farming and protected landscapes program. And they've since gone back on that. So if you're in an SFI pilot, you can still apply to the farming and protected landscapes program. In terms of sequestration and carbon trading, that's a really interesting question that I don't have a definitive answer to, because if what you get money from this program for gives you a commercial advantage to then sell your carbon on the open market, it might be classed as commercially valuable. I see there's another question coming up about whether the commercial gain has to accrue in the same year the grant's given. And this perhaps relates. And again, I don't know the answer to that specific question, but I suspect the answer is where there is a commercial gain, yes, it would count as commercial gain, even if the commercial gain comes later on, because it's seen as investment in your business. But there may be a state aid subsidy rule there, which which I'm not aware of, that affects that. Coming back to the sequestration and carbon trading, I can't see there being a conflict. I can see that if there's an obvious commercial benefit to you, then you might not get 100% funding. And if that doesn't answer the question, please come back to me.
Next question is from Sam Cartwright. If successful, what's the earliest funded projects can or should start?
They could start any time. So if we were able to approve applications at the first meeting of our panel, which is likely to be towards the end of August or the beginning of September, they could be approved then. In practice, it won't be quite then, but where starting work is urgent, perhaps because of the time of year or because of the availability of contractors, it is possible for us to start work or to authorise the start of work before we've waited 20 days for the RPA to come back to us for final confirmation about eligibility and double funding at our risk and your risk. So there's a certain amount of wiggle room in the process for us to move things forward earlier. But in principle, as soon as you have approval from us, from the panel, you should be able to start work.
Thank you, Henry. We've got a question from Jonathan Capes, who asks, will successful applications be granted approval before the 31st of January 2022, or are you going to wait for all the applications to be submitted before a decision is made?
Yes, they will be determined as and when they come in, as and when the panel meets for grants for over £5,000, and for those under, we will obviously deal with them in between without needing to fit in with panel meetings. I should have said the panel's due to meet every 6 to 8 weeks. We haven't yet recruited our whole panel, so we're still working on that. But once we've got everything in place, we'll be determining applications as soon as they're ready.
Sam Cartwright asks, how will this work for projects across more than one AONB?
That's one I do know the answer to. Where it straddles more than one protected landscape boundary, my understanding is the guidance is you're invited to apply to whichever protected landscape you want. And then it's up to those landscapes to decide whether they want to, which panel should make the assessment, or they can set up a joint panel to deal with applications that cross a common area. And then the decision would be made, as I understand it, by the panel which the 2 or more landscapes decide should make the, should deal with it, should assess it. And then you would be dealing with that protected landscape body. It's slightly different when it comes to appeals and complaints. Then I think you're asked to go through your local protected landscape, but I hope we won't get to that stage.
I'm going to move on to a question from Lord Carnarvon. What is the likely overall budget for the AONB for this grant package?
Do you want me to answer that one, Henry? Because I've just put the figures into a spreadsheet.
If you like.
The total that's available to give out to grants, assuming that we use the maximum for the admin and the advice costs, will be £656,000.
Thanks, Claire. I should explain that on top of that, there's about another £90,000 to £100,000, which is allocated for running the programme. So there's this is probably of interest to everybody, so I will explain it in a bit more detail. We are recruiting a Farming and Protected Landscapes business support officer to do the nuts and bolts of running the panel, dealing with the paperwork, the finances, the reporting. We have to report monthly, quarterly and annually to Defra, and managing all those elements of the administration. We're also trying to recruit a farming and protected landscapes officer who will basically lead our engagement with the farming and land management community. And over the last few years, we've tried to do much more of this, but with our very small team, we've really struggled. And it's been little bits of funding here and there that have gone to individual consultants and partners who've helped us with that. And we're very grateful for the work they've done for us. But it will be brilliant to have our own member of the partnership team who can lead our engagement with you as farmers and land managers. And those elements will be constant through the programme. At the moment, Defra is planning to front load the programme so that we have that amount, 650,000 this year, but considerably less in years 2 and 3 for project funding. We have made the case that we think that isn't terribly sensible if you rush the setup from a standing start and you're already well into the financial year. But we don't yet know whether there is wiggle room between Defra and the Treasury to change that. So we'll be doing our best to get your lovely applications in to spend all of that money within this financial year for the benefit of the North Wessex Downs, if we possibly can.
We've got a question from Nick Down. Do any water-based projects need catchment-sensitive farming approval, or can this be approved by the AONB team?
Henry, I think you're muted for some reason.
I'd only taken a breath at that stage, but thank you. Again, honest answer is I don't know. I do know that there's some guidance about this. And my instinct is that there is advice that you should get CSFO endorsement if you can, a bit like with the Facilitation Fund. If you've got endorsement, you get extra points, as I understand it. So my advice in any case would be try and get it. Whether it's formally required, I don't know. Certainly, we don't really have that expertise within the team, so we would just be going out and asking them anyway, probably.
Thank you. Next question from Sarah Dixon is, are applications annual up until 2024? So if you're not ready to apply before 31st of January 2022, can you apply the following year, i.e. before the 31st of January, I think she means 2023 there, and the last year for any application by January 2024?
Yes, I think that's my understanding. So for this financial year, applications got to be in by the end of January, and that's obviously quite quick work in terms of spending the money and claiming it by the end of March. But I think there may be some flexibility for us if we can commit the funds, you know, this financial year, even if, and don't quote me on this, if it spills over into a next financial year. As I said earlier, we will be considering applications for future years this financial year. So we'd be looking for applications, we would be open to applications for 2023-24 if you want to submit them in 22-23, if that makes sense. Just so that everybody's up and running so they can start work at the beginning of the financial year, so we're not doing it all at the last minute. And it's also possible to have multiple year projects, as we mentioned earlier, and in that case we would ask you to split the spending and the grant over however many years of the project was running, and we would then do reporting and claiming in accordance with that schedule.
We've got a question from Ian Nutt about can we make more than one application per organisation?
Yes, but Defra encourages you to prioritise your applications. And so would we. But obviously, if you cover a really wide area, another thing I should have said is we're looking for a geographical spread and a thematic spread, if possible. So, you know, if you had 5 and they're all in the same place, we'd possibly be less interested than if some of them were scattered around in other places.
Thank you. Karen Davis asks, some CSF and also land management options fall foul of the computer says no, rather than actually being an unsuitable idea. Will this scheme have the same sort of constraints as existing CS?
We hope not, because quite a lot of it will be about qualitative judgments to do with the objectives of designation and the management plan. Having said that, having not yet got to grips with the checking procedure which Defra have given us in terms of the RPA and stewardship, I don't yet know what delights that process holds and what potential hiccups might be within it. But I think there's a willingness on the part of everyone, from the team at Defra right down to everyone at every protected landscape partnership on the ground, to make it work. So we'll do our best to avoid that.
Thank you. We've got a question from Tom Hayward. Would you fund land purchase?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I suspect the answer may be no in itself, because land purchase in itself wouldn't provide the benefit, if you like, but everything that went with your land purchase, be that we're going to buy some land to restore it to heathland, the restoration would. And they do we are encouraging match funding and other contributions. So I suppose you could package them together potentially. That is a question we would have to ask Defra, to be sure. Sorry.
Thank you. And Lucy Charman is going back to budgets again. Is the 656,000 a total budget for the 3 years or an annual budget?
It's the project as in grant fund for this year. At the moment, we're expecting a significantly lower amount for the following 2 years, but it will still be substantial. As I said before, we are suggesting to Defra that it would be helpful to re-profile the spend, but because of the way the Treasury's spending review timetable works, with a spending review that was postponed from last year due this year, it's not quite that simple. So yeah, at the moment we're expecting 654 grants this year and possibly around 450 annually in the following 2 years. And if we don't spend all the money on admin and engagement, we can reallocate that to projects as well, which we'll obviously be doing if we have money available and projects to spend it on.
A linked question from Jonathan Capes. Is the grant fund a case of use it or lose it?
Pretty much, yeah. We're never allowed to carry any money over from Defra. It's always been a frustration to us with a 5-year management plan, you know, with obvious peaks and troughs in terms of our activity, that we're never allowed to carry over a single penny from 1 year to the next. And I'm afraid the same goes for this.
So I think, just to follow up what Henry's saying, I think we'll be keen to be encouraging projects to be developed that are coming forward now, to be ones that we can get off the blocks and potentially, you know, maximise the expenditure, because we've got that opportunity at the moment. But if we don't spend it by next March, then we will be handing some back, which would be a real shame. You know, this is an opportunity, but, you know, quite a challenge to everybody. Thank you. We seem to have come to the end of our questions. We've still got a couple of minutes that we can squeeze one or two more in if anyone's got a burning question that hasn't been covered so far.
While we're waiting, Corinna, can I just sort of reiterate that we are doing our best at the moment to engage with people who are coming forward with ideas. We have extraordinarily limited capacity because we're still expected to do all the other things that we have to do with our existing team. And our total annual budget for the partnership is about half of our first year budget for this programme, which gives you an idea of how big it is. And we also have one or two other sort of complications, like you probably can't see, but Corinna is at this moment in Cornwall. I'm in Salisbury. So, you know, we do our best, and we will do our best to come out and visit people and talk to them about their projects when we can. But until we've got everything up and running and the capacity in place, please bear with us. I apologise for that, but it's going to take a while to get airborne.
And actually, Lucy Charman has just come up with a question. Is it going to be possible to see an application form prior to applying so that the criteria can be fully understood to help with forward planning?
Absolutely. We will be putting, although we'd rather people came and talked to us first, so we don't really want people to go out and fill in an application form without talking to us. I think what we're going to do is we're going to put the application form on our website, possibly as a read-only version, so that you can see the thing and look at exactly what's entailed, but you won't be going off filling it in until we've had that conversation and we're ready to go with that. We will keep that under review. If that feels like it's vexatious and unhelpful, we'll obviously listen to feedback, but I hope we'll have that up very soon.
Okay. Thank you. Henry, have you got any other comments that you'd like to make before we close?
I think we've got another question.
Yes. So the question is there guidance for a size of grants re £5,000 to 50,000 for one project, quite apart from the budget limitation?
Another good question. I should have said that it's up to the protected landscape to set minimum and maximum grants if it wishes. Defra has suggested as a guide no more than £250,000 per grant. We are suggesting at the other end of the spectrum to make it worth the administrative cost, probably no less than £2,500. However, it will be up to the local assessment panel to confirm that. So at the moment, we don't know, but when the panel meets, one of the first things they'll decide is what do they want to be the maximum and minimum. And they might allow themselves a bit of flexibility for a really outstanding project.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I'm afraid that is about all that we have time for. Thank you very much for engaging with us and asking all those questions and for joining with us. I think there were nearly 50 people on the call, which was great. And basically, we will try to possibly turn some of these questions into FAQs that we can put on our website as a future resource. I'd like to thank Anna Trant, who's hosted today's event and has been working behind the scenes to make sure that everything does run smoothly. And we had a couple of glitches earlier today, so I was pleased that those gremlins didn't come out in our session. But thank you, and thank you most of all to Henry for sharing with us the emerging details on the Farming Protected Landscapes programme. So, as Henry said, at this early stage of the programme and before we've appointed staff, we're just still considering how we can best support you as potential applicants. We may offer further focused webinar sessions. We've been roughly trying to programme these about every 2 months or so going forward. But please let us know what you think you would find most helpful. Keep an eye out for further emails Refer to our website for any information and resources. We'll be trying to keep that updated and as relevant as possible for you all. And just before you go, please do take a minute to fill in the short feedback form as you leave. It really is very helpful to us and helps us to plan these future events. So thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye. Thank you.